we can welcome everybody for today's second LEPI webinar. So LEPI is the Law, Economics and Policy Initiative at Sciences Po, which is a joint venture between the Department of Economics at Sciences Po and the Law School at Sciences Po. So this new event follows the first successful event of 1 month ago with Thomas Piketty and Katharina Pistor on law and inequality. And today we are going to talk about antitrust markets with three amazing speakers. So I think that we will have a very nice active session because the three of them are very excellent speakers. And so let me start introducing them. So we are honored and pleased to have with us Lina Khan today. So Lina is an associate professor of law at Columbia University. She has done a lot of research. She's a prominent young scholar on antitrust law, infrastructure industries, and law and political economy. And she's recognized among the most important experts in the field in the United States. So Lina has also published extensively about these topics, both in books and in top law journals. So I'm very happy to welcome you, Lina. So the second speaker of today is Thomas Philippon. Thomas is a professor of finance at the Stern Business School at New York University. And Thomas is an economist that has done research in top finance and economic journals on a wider range of topics in economics and finance, from more micro to more macro. And recently, he's the author of a fantastic book, so one of the most interesting book of the books of the last couple of years. His book is very provoking and is basically giving his take on how America gave up on free markets. And in this book, he rings the bell, he rings the alarm bell, and he highlights the consequences of the rising concentration of corporate power on American capitalism and and the competition of American markets. And the third, so the last but obviously not least speaker of the day is Luigi Zingales. Luigi is a professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He's a world prominent expert in finance, law and economics, political and cultural economics. He has published also extensively in top journals in finance and economics. And is one of the most active economists highlighting the risk of interactions between political and market power concentration. So I think that we owe to Luigi a beautiful expression, one of my favorite expressions in political economy in recent years, where he highlights the risk of concentration and interaction of concentration of power, of economic power with politics, and he calls this the Medici's vicious circle. So Luigi, again, is at the front line in our discipline in these topics. So I'm very happy to welcome the three of you, and I'm looking forward to this discussion that we will have today. That will be first moderated by Émeric Henry from the Department of Economics and from Dina Waked from the Law School. So just before we start, just a little announcement. We will soon, please follow us on Twitter and on the website that we are starting maintaining regularly. And on this, you will have soon the advertisement of the next events. So in the next event will be a webinar on artificial intelligence and the law. So Luigi, Lina, and Thomas, the floor is yours together with Dina and Émeric.
So both Dina and myself, so we have it's a joint center, law and economics. So we'll have two voices, the economist and the lawyer. So for today, we chose admittedly a super ambitious theme. So the official title of the event is Antitrust, the Rise of Market Power and the Future of Capitalism. So we are probably too ambitious in our title. And so to maybe set the stage, given that all three of you contributed to this general theme, we'd like just to as an opening question for us to tell, for you to tell us about recent research or recent ideas or things that you think are essential on this topic for a few minutes, just to set the stage for our event. So maybe Lina, if you want to share a few thoughts to kick off the event, and then we'll go to Luigi and Thomas.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. And it's a real honor to be on a panel with two scholars whose work I so admire. So it's a fascinating moment in the public debate and discussion. I think over the last few years, we've seen just frankly a transformation in the enforcement environment relating to antitrust issues in the United States, especially as it relates to digital markets. And at the tail end of last year, we saw 3 lawsuits filed against Google, 2 lawsuits filed against Facebook. I think partly responding to the failures of the antitrust regime to keep up with the evolving market realities. We are seeing a more expansive debate now, looking at the ways in which ex-ante regulation and other policy levers can complement antitrust in order to ensure that these markets are, serving the public and are not being monopolized and allowing dominant firms to abuse their monopolies. In terms of both current research and where I think some questions need to be further looked at, I do think that what we're seeing in some ways is the bundling together of structurally competitive markets with structurally uncompetitive markets. And I think the discussion of the tech giants oftentimes happens at the firm level. And I think looking more at the market level, especially with firms like Amazon and Google that are integrated across so many lines of business, and understanding really, let's look at the search market, right? Let's disaggregate search into its multiple components of crawling, indexing, and querying, understand what are the technological features, what are the cost structures of each of these functions, and then try to understand, given these features, is competition the right way to govern this market, or do we instead want crawling to be some kind of utility function or some kind of essential facility where other companies should have access? So I think just generally speaking, that kind of market specific analysis in order to then ensure that we're using the right tools, be it competition and antitrust, or be it traditional regulatory principles like non-discrimination, like fair access. I think that's where some of the research and discussion should be going. And I think it's pushed in that direction by actions like those of the European Commission that is now thinking more expansively, not just about antitrust, but also about regulation. So I'll leave it there, but yeah, I think there's a lot more to discuss on this topic.
Okay, maybe Luigi can.
Sure, it is my pleasure to be in this meeting with Thomas and Lina, who have really advanced the cause of intervention, at least in the current situation in the United States and in the world. And I think that we are at a very important, turning point, because for most of at least my professional career, there was a dominant view that I would call the American version of liberalism, where you believe that markets naturally tend to become competitive. And so by and large, if you have a laissez-faire on the structuring point of view, eventually you're going to get a competitive market, and eventually everything is going to be fine. To be fair, and since we are in Europe, European liberals never thought that. And the German tradition of ordoliberalism, but also is often forgotten. The only Italian economist of the 20th century worth remembering is Luigi Einaudi. And Luigi Einaudi was very sort of in the spirit of ordoliberalism. And his view is very clearly articulated and say that the role of the state is to level the daily trenches that producers put to defend themselves. So there's a very much a view that competition is a goal that should be achieved through some form of intervention. Whether this is antitrust or takes other forms, then we can discuss. But you can't really rely on pure laissez-faire to lead to a structure of the economy, a structure of capitalism, given that the topic is the future of capitalism, given the structure of capitalism that works. Now, I'm not fair to my American colleagues because I think that Henry Simon, who was a professor at Chicago in the 30s and 40s, actually wrote a little pamphlet in the late 30s called A Positive Program for Laissez-Faire. So if you say positive program for laissez-faire, you understand that in order to get a competitive market, you need to intervene. And actually, Henry Simon was very much ahead of his time, including a tax on advertising that now Paul Romer is resurrecting as a solution to the digital platforms of market power. But so I think that once we have this turning point, then maybe we can start discussing what can be done. Now, what is interesting, and I think this panel by and large shows this, is what is interesting. The traditional industrial organization profession is absent here. And it says, Thomas is a macro financial economist. I'm a financial economist. Lina is a lawyer by training. You are going to find missing in action the traditional industrial organization experts. And then one of the questions I want to raise is why are they missing in action? But they should be at the forefront of this change. They don't seem to be. And I think that's part of what we're confronted. But I think that that's it's not only a political challenge, it's also an intellectual challenge that is worth fighting. And I think that and Lina has been at the forefront of this challenge in what is the role that the government should play through various ways, but one is to antitrust, and whether the goal is just purely economical, whether this is consumer welfare, whatever definition you want, or it's also political. In a sense, what we have seen a couple of weeks ago is that two men can prevent people from basically speaking freely in this country. If you have Google and Apple blocking the download of your app, you're out of luck. And so you have a concentration of political power that is, I think, unprecedented in the history of humankind. And I think that not discussing this because where economists will only look at prices and quantity, I think would be a big mistake.
Okay, maybe we'll turn to Thomas.
Thank you. Well, let me reiterate that it's a pleasure to be with you, and especially with Lina and Luigi. I came to that topic not really from the digital market, even though I'm sure we're going to spend a lot of time talking about specifically the digital market in this panel. I came from a slightly more mundane perspective, which is I grew up in France and I lived in various places in Europe. And when I moved to the US 20 years ago, it was striking that the US was a more competitive marketplace than Europe was, and by a big margin. The most striking market for me was the telecom market, where essentially all telecom services, that is how much you pay for your cell phone plan and how much you pay to get internet at home, all of that was about 30% cheaper in the US than in Europe. And 20 years later, Europe, in all of this market, is about 40 or 50% cheaper than the US. So that big change is why I call the book that you referred to at the beginning, Roberto, The Great Reversal, because it's quite striking that you go from a situation where clearly Europe is lagging to a situation where clearly Europe is leading in that specific market. And so I wanted to understand how the degree of competition can change and how it interacts with regulation, antitrust, and political economy. So this is still something that I find very interesting, although thankfully, it looks like in part, thanks to the effort of people like Lina, there is a revival of active antitrust in the US. So I hope that the US did not really give up on free market, but this story still needs to be told. But what's interesting now is that we're going to have different ways of tackling the problem. So it's quite clear if you look at the recent trend that Europe is still going to continue with a relatively strong emphasis on regulation, on the setting of rules. Now, this is not surprising to some extent because the EU is first a body that makes rules. It is not first a political body. And so the rulemaking part of the EU has always been at the core, and now is de facto a world leader in regulation. Think about privacy or ex-ante regulation of various markets. Much of the rest of the world is looking at the EU as an example of what they should do in their own market. I was amazingly struck when something I did not expect at all when I was touring and giving talks around the world on Zoom, of course, for the book, that if you talk to policymakers in Korea, if you talk to policymakers in South Africa, in Japan, I mean, they all refer to EU regulations, like they know the EU regulations because they think, oh, maybe there's something good in there we should adopt. So that's I think, an interesting trend. On the other side of the Atlantic, the US is reviving its antitrust, but it's taking a different route. There will be some ex-ante regulation in the US, but the emphasis is more on structural action on the antitrust side. So I think that's going to be something that's going to be very interesting to watch going forward, because these are two different ways to sort of go after the same problems. And we're going to see which one works and which one doesn't work. I think everybody agrees that we're going to have a convex solution. We're going to have a bit of both, but nobody quite knows where the emphasis should be, and in which case is it more efficient to try to set up ex-ante regulation, and in which case is it more efficient to go with antitrust separation, breakdown, or structural remedies ex post. We don't know, and I think that's something we're going to be able to learn over time in the next few years.
Okay, so this is a great introduction because we cover pretty much every theme that we're going to organize with the question with Dina, except maybe the trial of IO economists that Luigi wanted to start. That we'll be leaving aside. Apart from that, we'll be covering.
Well, actually, I have something to say about that as well, but I want to keep it for later.
Okay, maybe we'll keep it for later, the trial of IO economists. So we'll start with market and competition with Dina. Then I'll talk about the future of antitrust, and we'll cover in extensively this ex-ante versus ex-post interventions, and how the US and EU approach are complementary or in competition. So how they were going to interact. And then we'll talk about market power and democracy with the points that Luigi raised at the end of this section. So maybe Dina will start with the first section on markets and competition.
All right, so thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today. You've all contributed to pioneering work on antitrust that's not only shaping antitrust discussion, public opinion, but also competition policy as we see it unfolding now. So my first question has to do with the notion of competition that you all incorporate in your work. And here I would like to ask what your thoughts are on the emerging discussion on the harms of competition. So there has been a recent spread in the literature on the effects of competition, particularly the negative effects on competition. And here, maybe what I would try to flesh out is what you think of perfect competition in both its neoclassical microeconomic sense, but also perfect competition as a regulatory policy that considers competitive market as the ideal market structure that we should strive for in and of itself, but also as a means to pressure monopolistic structure and to limit all of their negative effects. So do we really believe in the ability of competitive markets to achieve that? Is competition really desirable? Is it really capable of limiting monopoly evils and all of the negative effects that we're witnessing? Or are competitive markets partially responsible for the rise of concentration, for inequality, particularly when we look at the global south and the race to the bottom and how competitive markets negatively affect markets in the global south, environment, labor, and other sustainability goals? So that's, I know, a broad question, but I would like to hear a little bit. It would be great to see how you incorporate the notion of competition in that sense and with these sort of limitations in your work. So I don't know who would like to go first, but maybe we can start with the economists and then Lina. So Luigi and Thomas.
Okay, I'm happy to start. So it's very important to understand what we can do with competition, what we cannot do, and what are the cost of having sort of hard competition without the proper rules. I remember many years ago, the first time I went to India, a friend told me, don't go to the private market, go to the state-owned stores, because they're not going to cheat you. And, you know, as a Chicago economist, I was a bit puzzled that people locally was actually advertising the state-owned stores as better than the free market. And the answer is very simple, is because in a state-owned store, you have no incentives. No incentives to treat well the customer, but also no incentive or very low incentive to cheat. In the private market, the incentive are very strong, both to do better, but also to cheat. And if you have a system that does not punish cheating, then the damage can be that private markets are maximizing the cheating. So if you have competition without the proper rules, I think the disasters you make can be very large. And what you're talking about the South, I think that one thing that we see very clearly is that Western companies are corrupting local governments and getting away with that. And that's devastating for not only the economics, but the political system of Africa, and of course, the ability of Africa to develop. And each one say, oh, but it's not my fault because the others doing. And now that the Western countries are trying to draft rules that should apply to everybody, say, oh, it's fault of the Chinese, because the Chinese are coming, they play by different set of rules. So in order to keep up with them, we need to. So I don't think that competition without this proper set of rules is gonna fix it all. And of course, the ultimate perfect competition does not exist in the real world. So we don't want to push it too hard. However, I think that antitrust is aimed at trying to improve the competition in the market, and other regulation is designed to fix other problems. So in a sense, it's very easy. I think any first-year economist will tell you that if you have a monopoly, you have less production. And then if the production is polluting, less production is less pollution. So should we favor monopolies because they pollute less? No, we should have competition and we should have regulation about pollution. I think it's as simple as that. So going in the other direction would be, in my view, a gigantic mistake. So we need to be very careful in saying what competition law can achieve and what competition law cannot achieve. And if we say the competition law is going to fix everything, I think we're diluting ourselves. And we need to fix competition law. We need to fix a lot of other things.
Yeah, so I think that of course, I agree with what Luigi said, which is, you know, the competition in the market is very good at doing one thing, which is achieving, maximizing profits, cutting the waste. And that's kind of what it does well. Now, if the rules are such that by doing so, you don't harm other constituents, so we take into account what we call externalities, like pollutions, for instance, then, you know, competition is good. If not, you can imagine cases where competition could be negative. And then this is usually what we refer to as race to the bottom. But I want to take a step back, and I think if you ask me at the end of the day, is competition good everywhere? The short answer is yes. And the reason the short answer is yes is because although you can construct, clearly on the theory side, it's easy to construct examples. Historically, we have some examples, but the overwhelming majority of cases shows that competition is good. And it is not because of micro theory. There's a meta reason for that. The meta reason is that if you think about the situation where maybe there's some kind of trade-off and too much competition could be harmful, and you think about all the incentives of the various players in the system, there is almost always more incentive towards restricting competition too much than incentive towards creating too much competition. So it is not that competition everywhere is always perfect and the best thing. It is that at the end of the day, once you take into account the influence of the various players on the regulators, on the legal system, on the politicians, the overwhelming number of cases is such that you have more incentive to restrict than to favor competition, which is why at the end of the day, if you look around the world, it's very hard to find cases where we have too much competition, and very easy to find cases like Comcast in the US, where clearly there is not enough competition. So I think that's kind of the big picture. Now, after that, we have to be careful because, for example, competition and concentration, to a first order, have nothing to do with each other. That's kind of the first thing that has to be clear. Like, if you make a market more competitive, concentration is going to go up, not down, right? Because if markets are more competitive, the margins shrink, the firms to be larger to be able to sustain their fixed costs. So that means that you cannot just think about, oh, I'm going to just look at concentration. That's going to tell me whether the market is competitive or not. Like most of the examples we have in well-defined markets, if you make it more competitive, you're going to have more concentration. Okay, so the way competition shows up and all the details, that's very, very complicated, and you have to be super specific. But I think the meta reason to keep in mind is really that in the system, once you take into account lobbying, there's just more power trying to reduce competition than trying to increase competition. And the reason at the end of the day is just because competition has the flavor of a public good, which is, as a consumer, I'd like every market to be a bit more competitive. But that's a very diffuse benefit. Therefore, nobody has a very strong incentive to advocate for that. While each specific industry has a very strong incentive to make sure that they don't face too much competition. I think at the end of the day, that's the core of the argument.
I would say my starting point in thinking about these questions is not competition per se, but it's instead the recognition that market structure is a policy vehicle, right? The laws and rules that we have to shape and structure markets are a vehicle for policy goals. And so the first step is to have some clarity about what those goals are. And then the next step is to identify the market arrangements and the structures that will further those policy goals. In some cases, it will be competition. In other cases, it's going to be infrastructure rules and regulations. In some cases, it'll be allowing coordination, right, rather than competition. So be it in the labor context where we allow collective bargaining. So I think for me, kind of competition comes after clarity about the policy goals and the recognition that competition will be appropriate in some contexts for some policy goals, but not for others. It is true that in the US, the foundational antitrust laws do identify the dispersion of economic power as a key policy goal. I think the translation of those foundational principles into a workable regime of law enforcement has not always been successful. I think what competition means in US antitrust law is actually quite underdeveloped and oftentimes is incoherent. And I think that's why you have, on the one hand, when you have companies trying to merge and then the government trying to block that merger, you have both sides arguing that their preferred outcome is going to be the way to generate more competition. And then you have this generalist judge saying, you're telling me that merging is going to be the way to make this market more competitive. You're telling me that blocking this merger is going to be the way to make this market more competitive. What does competition really mean here? In the Ninth Circuit last year in the Qualcomm decision, you had the court say, well, the purpose of competition is not even to necessarily serve customers. So I think there is actually a lot of incoherence about what competition means within our legal regime, whether that is due to underdeveloped nature in the economics field, or if that concept in the economics field has not been adequately translated into the law, I think is an open question for me. But I do think that when we think about how competition law in the US is being operationalized, there are a lot of flaws, and many of those flaws come from the fact that this notion of competition in the legal context is very easily manipulated. So I'll leave it at that.
Maybe I'll jump in to push you a bit more on that question. And none of you mentioned innovation. Is it by choice? Or some observers might say, okay, we look now at the question of the vaccine. Big pharma seems to have played a major role. Don't we have a value of having large firms, even though this debate on competition and innovation has not been closed? It seems that for major innovations, size still matters. So do you have a take on this?
Well, actually, I think in that case, all the good ideas came from small firms. The big pharma only came up for the production side. So I think that's a case in point for why innovation happens in small firms. But That business model has evolved in pharma over the past 20 years, very deliberately actually. They just realized they were not very good at this kind of radical innovation. So decided their business model would be, they would have production facilities and they would have an ecosystem of small firms trying crazy stuff. And then they would just buy them or team up with them once one of them is successful. So that's actually an interesting case of a partial, not full of course, but a partial separation of innovation by relatively decentralized teams in relatively smaller firms with a centralized production facility, because production, that's the place where you have the predictable return to scale. There is return scale in all of these, but the one that are very predictable is on the production side. So I think that's actually arrangement sort of makes sense to me.
Yeah, I agree with Thomas. In addition to that, you can say the opposite and say the sector of vaccine was very, very much behind in innovation. And it took this pandemic and a lot of money set up by the US government. And it's just, we cannot say anything positive about Trump, otherwise we die. But I think Operation Warp Speed was not a bad idea. And the way they structure actually the compensation was a very big incentive. And my reading, and of course I'm not an expert, my reading is we've made 20 years of progress in vaccine in 1 year, thanks to that system, which brings to the problem of why in the previous 20 years, we didn't have those progress. And I think that's part of the concentration of the industry, both on the production side and also on the demand side, that doesn't really create the right incentives to produce vaccines. So I don't think that necessarily concentration in the industry will lead to high innovation. In fact, I think that is often quite the opposite, especially when it comes to radical innovation. And I think that we need to maintain competition in the market in order to favor this radical innovation.
I would echo those points on the innovation component. Thomas mentioned that the innovation came from these small companies, and then they partner up with the big companies for operationalize and distributing and getting the thing out. I also think we have an interesting example within the pharmacy context in the US. So the US government in many states has partnered with big pharmacies like CVS, like Walgreens, to distribute the vaccine. And some states actually have laws that keep out big chain pharmacies. And by and large, from my understanding of the situation, it's actually been the independent pharmacies that have been far more effective at distributing the vaccine and actually getting it out to citizens. And a lot of the disruptions and the holdups and the lags are associated with the big pharmacies like CVS. The US health system is really concentrated across the whole supply chain. So even when you look at things like medical supplies, there are shortages of certain types of syringes needed for the vaccine. And even that market is monopolized by one company that controls a huge portion of the syringe supply market. So I think we're seeing in real time right now, not just even in the innovation component, but even across the supply chain when it comes to distribution and access, the ways in which concentration is hurting us rather than helping.
Lina, can you elaborate on that? Because I've seen stories of West Virginia, for example. I think that's where you refer to. West Virginia, for those of you who don't live to the United States, is the state with the best vaccination record. And is not exactly the most advanced state in the United States, to be polite. And so how did they accomplish this? One story I read, but I know nothing about, is through their independent pharmacy. Can you elaborate why the independent pharmacy is so much better?
It's a great question. I think the short answer is I don't know the intricate details about their mechanics of how they were able to get it out. But you're right, it's mostly a rural state. So West Virginia, but also South Dakota, New Mexico, North Dakota in particular has a law banning basically chain forms of chain pharmacies, and they've been doing better as well. I don't know the mechanics of what it is that's allowing the independents to do better here, but yeah, I think it's a really interesting natural experiment that we're seeing.
I mean, from what I read about West Virginia, it looks a little bit like the evidence we have from the disbursement of money to SMEs, that if SMEs that banked with relatively large banks were slower to get government funds last summer from the support program than SMEs that bank with relatively smaller banks locally, that seem to be just more agile at coming up with a way for their SMEs to apply to no. So it's at the interaction between the government supply and the local level that it seems that if the goal is at the end to distribute, in that case, a vaccine, or it could be federal help money to SMEs, that interaction seemed to be, the last leg of that interaction seemed to work better with relatively smaller entities, the banks in one case or the pharmacy in the other. But I don't know if it's a common theme or just an exception.
One additional factor that I am recalling in the independent pharmacy context is that many of them have much closer relationships with patients. And so they were much better equipped to reach out to patients directly. They had more patient data. They were able to just roll it out to the people that needed it most according to the priority hierarchy more effectively, because they just, independent pharmacies, I think study shows, just have better relationships with the residents and customers.
Just like we have in banking, Luigi, right? The same idea.
No, it's true. But what is funny is that there is a huge literature saying that, especially when it comes to digital data, large is better. And so you would expect that when it comes to, for example, large databases, because one thing is you call 3 friends that you know have a pre-existing condition. But if you want to do a systematic deployment, a priori, I would have said, the large, well-organized digital infrastructure pharmacy would be better. So the fact that we don't see that is fascinating, and maybe speaks very highly of the profit motives. I think that if I am a single independent pharmacy, I make more money by deploying the vaccine faster. I find a way. If I am in a chain, I follow orders, and I'm not creative.
So maybe just a small follow-up on that, and I think this was a great take on the notion of competition and how we think of markets. But some of you, and particularly with the discussion on innovation, mentioned that in some instances, particularly Lina, you were saying that in some instances it's better not to decide a priori whether we want competition per se. Here, maybe my question to you is then, how do we make the balance? How do we decide what markets and in what context? You said we need to look at the goals and what it is that we want and then tailor the laws accordingly. And maybe my question is what exactly would that look like? What would you recommend, or what you've written on to somehow strike the balance between a certain level of cooperation and competition to achieve desirable outcomes?
I think there are a couple of things, right? So one is the very traditional kind of economic analysis of the underlying cost structure, kind of understanding what are the economic features of these underlying technologies. Are there reasons why we should expect certain types of economies of scale or network effects such that we may want to preserve concentration? And in those instances, how do we then ensure that the individuals or executives or firms that are capturing control over these naturally concentrated markets are not able to abuse that control? I think we need to look at the power asymmetries in a particular market. So are there reasons to think that in certain contexts, there's going to be a necessarily power imbalance, right? So in the US, in the employment context, there's been a recognition that the workers are always going to have less bargaining power than their employers. And so therefore, we're going to allow workers to organize and collectively bargain against their employers. There have been similar recognitions in agriculture, where there are exemptions to the antitrust laws that are granted to farmers, to co-ops, again, recognizing that there's going to be an intrinsic power imbalance between farmers and between the meat packers and processors that they're going to be dependent on to get to market. So I think that's the type of analysis that we need to do, and to understand that competition is going to be appropriate in some contexts, and then even within industries or even within markets for certain aspects of these markets or certain parts of the supply chain, but not others. But I think it has to be, frankly, a very fact-specific inquiry.
I mean, the notion of natural monopolies and essential market facilities has been around for more than a century. So So I think that part is pretty, I don't think that's changed at all. I think the thing that's new is when you apply it to a new industry, you need to figure out what's the right framework to analyze their production function, really. So like, think about if you think about essential market facilities, so then typically we try to distinguish like the pipes from what goes into the pipes. Now, if you think about electricity or gas, it's pretty straightforward because the pipes haven't really changed in, like 50 years. And the question is, so obviously you're not going to have like, 5 pipes bringing either electricity or gas in the same house, but then you could have people competing to provide the actual electricity or the gas. So that's, I think we understand how I don't think there is much need to change. The tricky part is when you try to apply this way of thinking to the digital market, then you realize that the pipes change very quickly and endogenously. So then you have the question about, should I really regulate the pipes as an essential facility? And if I do that, will I have a negative impact on innovation about the pipes themselves? That is the tricky question that I'm sure we're going to discuss more later.
So I don't want to sound too much the Italian here, but I think there is some value in going to the etymology of the word competition. The word competition is cum petere, is you look for something together, from Latin, okay? So I think that, and by the way, in Spanish, competencia is both competition and competence. Because there is some sense that if you search things together, the one winning are the best. So that's kind of the feature of competition that we like. But very often today, the word competition is rivalry, is fight, is anything you do to win, okay? Which is not the notion of competition we have normally in economics. And so the two are very often equivocated at a very large cost, because there is a recent book looking at the digital platforms by a guy called Petit, who looks at the annual reports of digital platforms and say that these guys live in fear of somebody taking them over. And so he concludes that there is no problem of competition because there is a lot of potential entry, and these guys live in fear of potential entry. Now, when I discussed his book, I said, this reminds me very much of the mafia. And it says, in the mafia, every family lives in fear of being displaced by another family. And so in a sense, there is a lot of competition. I'm sorry to report it's not the competition we like, because the way they're trying to prevent the competition is by killing each other. Now, fortunately, digital platforms have not gone that far yet. We'll see in the future, but not far yet. But the idea is similar in the following sense, that the way the mafia family is trying to block potential entrant is by doing things that are very bad for us, okay? We like competition economics because the way you prevent a competitor is by either reducing prices or offering better quality. That stuff is the stuff we like and we want more of it. If you start to create competition by putting roadblocks and landmine along the way to make it difficult for you to enter, that is the problem, is what I would like to relabel contrapetition, because it's against, but maybe it's too technical. But anyway, the point I want to make is we observe a lot of this negative competition in the marketplace, especially with digital platforms. So I think that what is novel in this business is the ability to put roadblocks for the new entrant is enormous. And so one of the things, that's the reason why I cited an audit to begin with, because I think that one of the big things that authorities should do is really level the daily trenches without even saying what is the final goal of this. But as economists, we know that if you put a barrier to entry, which has no relation with efficiency, then that barrier to entry is bad and should not exist. And the firm putting it should be punished for putting it. And I think that that's what a lot of the goal should be in this moment.
Great, thank you very much. And I think this is a perfect transition to Aymerique's next part on the future of antitrust, exactly to talk about how can we achieve that kind of competition that we would like to see on the market.
Yeah, so we'll probably start from Lina's question on ex ante versus ex post, and so if we move specifically to the digital markets, so the EU is thinking now of passing this Digital Markets Act with the idea of creating ex ante regulation through an agency that would set rules, etc. While the US seems to have more the orientation towards antitrust, structural remedies, so an ex post approach. So here it's a difficult question. How do we balance this ex post and ex ante? What's the relative merits? It's not new to digital markets. You had the same question for telecom, I guess, or for other markets, but it seems to be very present here. And second, if the US and the EU adopt completely different approaches, how will this play out? So is there a problem of the interaction of the two big blocs choosing different approaches? So maybe we'll start with Lina, given that you raised the question initially.
I would say it's probably too early to offer a definitive account of the direction in which the United States is going. The US had not seriously enforced its antitrust laws for at least 2 decades, probably longer. And so the recent spate of cases filed against Facebook and Google, I think, is the earliest moment at which, the deep ice age in which we were stuck is now beginning to melt a little bit. I think there is a lot of interest in thinking through the potential for ex ante rules and regulation, especially in instances where it's recognized that competition is not going to be adequate, be it due to network effects or other features that render some of these markets more susceptible to tipping and scale economies. So I would just say, I think that kind of dichotomy and placing the US on the side of the just antitrust without regulation is probably too early to determine. I think it is very promising that the complaints that the Justice Department, the FTC, and the states filed do call for structural breakups, because I think it recognizes a couple of things. One is that in instances where you had these serial acquisitions, like the ones that Facebook engaged in, that were illegal, that those should be undone, right? That there isn't a free pass just because enforcers at the time didn't realize that these were illegal mergers. And second, I think there's a recognition that some of this conduct, and this is especially true with Google and Google's role in basically dominating every part of the digital ad tech stack, that arrangement, right, having both controlling the exchange and then having a position on the buy side, having a position on the sell side, that creates so many conflicts of interest that can be abused in a host of whole ways, that that if you really want to address the root of the problem, you have to target the source of that conflict of interest, which is the integration in the first place. And so in the same way that we have rules, and Dina Srinivasan has done really fantastic work on this, in the same way that we have rules prohibiting those conflicts of interest structurally in other markets, that we need to be thinking about those same set of principles in the context of digital markets. So I think that's very promising. In terms of what types of ex ante rules we might see, the US House Antitrust Subcommittee, which I had the privilege of being a part, produced a report last year with a set of recommendations, both on the competition side, which primarily focused on overriding judicial precedent that had really suffocated the antitrust laws. And then on the ex ante side, really thinking through ways, both through non-discrimination principles, through interoperability principles, and through line of business restrictions, how can we use those tools to actually engender competition, specifically to ensure that a company that has dominated one market is not able to then use that dominance to further monopolize a whole set of markets, right? This kind of ecosystem tipping that we're seeing in these markets. So I think that seems to be at least one direction in which lawmakers could go. But again, I think we're at the early stages of this discussion in the US, and so it'll be interesting to see how things unfold.
So I think that when you think about this issue, I think it's important to try to separate a few ideas or a few concepts. So the first is like there will always be a balance between ex ante regulations, merger reviews, and then antitrust actions afterwards. Now today we are also to some extent dealing with a backlog of things that should have been done in the past. And therefore, there's a specific issue today. It's a bit like, you know, the legacy of a financial crisis, which is a lot of debt that you have to deal with. This is like a legacy of 20 years of not doing enough antitrust. We have a backlog of stuff that should have been done in the past. So there's going to be an issue of how do we deal with that backlog, which is probably not something that's going to last forever. And then for dealing with that backlog, I think it's pretty clear to me that you're going to have very different approaches in the EU and the US. So at least for the next 10 years, I can see that it's going to be quite different, because I think they're going to adopt slightly different ways to deal with the backlog. Now, in the steady state, or if you're in the balanced future where we have all of this, I don't know if the differences are going to be that strong. It seems to me that merger reviews are going to change, are going to be a bit more aggressive. And I don't necessarily think they're going to be that different between the EU and the US. I think if you look at the discussion we've had over the past 5 years, people recognize that merger reviews were too weak. Okay, so we allowed too many mergers. And then the question becomes, okay, what is it that we can change, right? Well, there are 3 ideas. One is you lower the threshold. So, you know, like usually if an acquisition is small, we just don't look at it. Maybe that threshold was too small. Well, that we know is not going to work very well, because the Germans tried it and then they ended up, in theory, having to investigate mergers of SMEs that are just not very relevant. So simply lowering the threshold is not going to do it. Then the other 2 questions or 2 ideas to improve the merger review was, one of them was look at the transaction value. So not so much the size of the target measured by the revenues, but how much the acquirer is willing to pay. And we know that creates issues of, you know, perhaps market manipulations. But these are just, okay, that means it's not a perfect measure, but I don't think anybody today would imagine that going forward, we're going to do merger reviews without looking at how much the acquiring firm is willing to pay for the target, irrespective of the size of the target. I think that idea is clearly there now. The only question is how we're going to implement it. The idea that you want to, and that of course is very tightly connected to the idea of killer acquisition, which is if you're really willing to overpay a lot compared to some measure of revenues today, that means something in the back of your mind is strategic and could be a killer acquisition. That idea, I think, is becoming mainstream extremely quickly, both in the EU and the US. And the last thing that was discussed was, you know, after like lower the threshold, take market value into account, and then the third one was accept the fact that you're going to have to change your mind ex post a bit more often than before, which is that accept the fact that perhaps there's a sense in which even if you give the green light for a merger, you might change your mind 3 years later. And it sucks because we don't like this kind of unpredictability, but it's second best because given that we have to make decisions in real time without all the information, that's going to be part of life. And so we're going to do a bit more of that. I think these ideas are going to be common in the EU and the US, and we're going to learn from each other in the way we implement them.
So I will add to the list that Thomas was saying, also potentially the change in presumption. I think that one thing we learned over the last 40 or 50 years is that with the existing presumption and the existing resources of hiring talented economists to prove the impossible, I think that it's very hard to find any case of market abuse or etc. Or any merger that is not justified by some efficiency reason, especially if there is not an ex post analysis whether this is true. So basically, the way you can get a merger approved is just by proving that at least in theory, there are some efficiency reason for the mergers, and at least in theory, prices will not go up. And that's too simple to prove. I think that especially when a lot of money is at stake to prove this, there are a lot of smart people that are willing to prove it. And so all mergers are approved. So I think that what we need to do is invert the burden of proof, at least in some sector. The digital sector comes to mind, because otherwise we're not going to go anywhere. And two, and this is in the spirit of what Thomas was saying, is also doing more systematically ex post analysis and say, look, if in X number of cases we said, oh, this is going to be welfare improving for consumers, but ex post in 90% of the cases was not, then maybe there is something wrong and we need to change our presumption. And I think this is something that is not done and is a problem. Where I differ a bit with Thomas is, I think he's much more optimistic about the greatness of Europe than I am. I think maybe this is a fact that he's French and I'm Italian. And Italians are always very pessimistic in their analysis. The French are much more optimistic and they think they can change the world. The Italians can only see holes in the world. So I'm very much in that tradition. But I think that there are two reasons why the EU is more advanced in this moment than the United States. Number one is that the big digital platforms are American. And so it's much easier politically to go after digital platform in Europe than it is in the United States. When artificial intelligence will move into the car manufacturing, you're going to see a completely different ball game, because Germany is going to defend its car industry in every possible form or shape. And I bet that it's going to be the other way around. So I have a refutable prediction. My prediction is that when this monopolization or digitalization will reach the car market, the US is going to be more advanced than Europe, but we'll see. The second, and this is an important feature, is the EU Commission can act first and then have judicial review, and the United States is the other way around. And so by design is more slow to intervene, and we will see how many of the allegation or claim that have been done by the European Commission will eventually last in the long term. But I agree that in the meantime, something is happening, because the EU Commission can intervene and scares the hell out of the big firms. Now, the big firms are fighting back. If you look at the amount of lobbying that is taking place in Europe by Google, then you realize that they're fighting back. And so I don't know how much longer the European Union would be at the forefront. But the interesting question is, and this is related also to what Emeric was saying earlier, the interesting question is that there is an international component of antitrust that we tend to ignore in our analysis, but it's very, very important. This is not unique of the digital world, in a sense. In the Armstrong Siemens merger that was struck down, there were, of course, implications for Brazil, for example, because in Brazil they buy trains, and you have the competition, and this concentration will impact tremendously Brazil. So I think that we need to start thinking about an international authority for competition, but the United Nations doesn't work very well to begin with, so I doubt that they can take that.
I would real quick just add one more factor to Luigi's list of the key differences. The US, through the 60s, through the 70s, had very extensive, very elaborate regulatory regimes spanning all sorts of industries. And the kind of assault on the regulatory state, primarily, launched by a lot of prominent Chicago critics, was very effective, right? We kind of saw wholesale deregulation in the US across industries. And I think one legacy of that intellectually has been that a lot of the learning that we had done through our experience with detailed regulation of these sectors has been lost. And I think there is still this legacy reflexive allergy to regulation in a way that has actually left, I think, the US somewhat ill-equipped and under-equipped to think about these problems with the full set of tools at our disposal. I'm teaching a course right now on infrastructure industry regulation, and the casebooks, the textbooks for law schools that were most comprehensive on this topic are from the 60s and 70s, right? Starting in the 80s, these textbooks just got smaller and smaller, narrower and narrow, and really left out a lot of core material. And I think a lot of the scholarship critiquing infrastructure industries regulation ended up focusing tremendously on rate regulation, on the limits of rate regulation, on the problems with rate regulation, on the difficulty that government has when trying to calculate what's a fair return on value. And I think, you know, we may have disputes about whether rate regulation is good or bad, when it's good or bad, but I think just the outsized focus on rate regulation ended up crowding out attention to a lot of other important tools that were also part of the regulatory state. And so when we threw out regulation, we also ended up throwing out a whole set of legal mechanisms and devices that we've traditionally applied, especially when dealing with dominant intermediaries. So all of that's to say, I think the US also needs to do a lot of work to recover a lot of that learning and refocus our attentions to kind of get past this reflective allergy that has been quite common in the US when thinking about regulation.
So can I just add one thing to what Lina was saying?
Yeah.
I think that's so I completely agree, but I think there's a deep connection between what Lina said and what Luigi emphasized, which is that it's a global problem, and it's a good thing that not everybody is trying exactly the same rule book, because we're going to learn from each other. I mean, so let's review some of the examples. So for instance, like one thing we've learned in recent years is that when you want to do antitrust, you know, whistleblowers are extremely important. And the US has been much better at using, leveraging, and protecting the whistleblowers than the EU. Well, we figured that out, and now we're trying to do exactly what the US has been doing because it works better. And I think it's even more true in digital markets. It's even more true in all industries where the amount of data is so large that if you don't know where to look, there is just simply no way you're going to find anything. And that's true in finance. For all of these cases, you need a whistleblower. You need an insider telling you where to look. So in that case, I think clearly the idea was that the US did that better and the EU got inspired. If you think about, I totally agree with the issue of the car industry. I mean, one example that is striking, of course, is the Dieselgate. And the reason we stopped polluting European city with badly regulated diesel engines is thanks to a bunch of kids in California, NGOs, who decided to run a real test drive of a Volkswagen and realized that they were completely lying. Now, of course, everybody in Europe who was a bit involved knew that. They were just looking the other way. This is pure corruption. Like, how hard is it? Just imagine what they did. All they did was take a car and drive it on the road. Amazing idea, with something to measure whether the emission was the same as the one in the lab. I mean, this is like, you know, the fact that the regulator didn't do that, they say you that's just pure corruption. So in that case, the fact that this diesel lobby was very strong in Europe, very weak in the US, allowed us to import the right solution from the US. And with respect to regulation, I think, hopefully, we're going to see some of that, which is, it is true that it has been somewhat sidelined in the US, but in Europe, it's not. And maybe actually we went too far the other way, but there's too many regulations here. That's possible too. But at the very least, when the US is going to design regulation with respect to privacy, or even like the DMA, DSA issue, they will see what was tried in Europe, what worked and what failed. And I think keeping that, I think, is, to me, the overwhelming objective.
So I would like to emphasize something that Tomas said, because it's very important. And I always thought that one of the big benefits of having a not concentrated industrial structure is that lobbying is not homogeneous on the same dimension. So when I wrote my book almost 10 years ago, for example, I said that I changed my mind on Glass-Steagall, which is a separation of investment and commercial banking that exists in the United States, not so much or only for the typical economic argument, but also for a lobbying argument, i.e. that is in the past when you had for example, insurance industry and bank industry at each other because they were separated. The kind of pressure they were making was different. And so if I was a decent congressperson or a decent senator, I would try to look and hear different side of the same equation. When you had all those mergers, the senators got all the same picture by the financial industry that was lobbying very compactly. And you had conservative people, Republican senators, that saying they've never felt steamrolled by the financial industry as much as in the 2004 bankruptcy reform. So I think that And the idea that, for example, the reason why we found out about the diesel problem is certainly for the NGOs and those kids, but also because diesel is not so big in the United States. Otherwise, the regulators will have prevented that. So this is an extra reason why we need competition and differentiation, because concentration and homogeneity makes it difficult for the truth to emerge.
Okay, so that was a great discussion. Let me switch slightly the focus and focus on the objective of antitrust. We tend to think separately of antitrust regulation targeting competition, and then other types of regulation focusing on the questions of inequality, environmental impact, etc. Would you agree that taking into account, for instance, when we considering mergers, potential impact of mergers on environmental dimensions or on dimensions of inequality, should it be something that's integrated in the criteria, or should it just be left for the activities of the merged firm that will be later on regulated?
Let me intervene here because I suspect I might have a different view from Lina here, but let me state my view. I think it's quite dangerous to give a multiple objective function to whoever makes the decision. In a sense, if there was one thing that the Chicago School of Antitrust, that now is blamed for everything, was right, is the difficulty of administerability of the antitrust. When you have a vague statute, especially in a common law country like the United States, and you delegate the judges to make decisions, you cannot expect these judges to make very complex trade-off decisions that are also technical or they are massively political. So if you now we see that the GM is moving into electric cars. That's a great idea. It's going to cost a lot of employment because electric cars need very few parts or fewer parts and need fewer workers to produce them. So imagine now, this is not a merger, but imagine there is a merger. Do you really want a judge to make this decision? I think this decision is important to be done at the political level. And but you want to have clear objective function that the judges can implement, because the last thing you want is everybody to come up with their view. And so depending on whether you get a Democratic judge in New York or a Republican judge in Alabama, you get a completely different answer to the same problem that will destroy, to some extent, the certainty of law, which is part of what the rule of law is about.
I agree entirely with Luigi. I think that the judges should not be anointed as policymakers. And one of the contributions of the Chicago School in practice was actually to greatly empower judges through introducing the rule of reason standard and through shifting away from bright line rules and per se rules towards rule of reason, such that now judges and courts in the US are really the only institutional body that are engaged in creating substantive antitrust rules. I think the kind of value trade-offs and the value decisions need to be done at the political level, as Luigi said, by Congress. And then the administrative agencies, the executive agencies, also need to be taking a much greater role in creating these substantive antitrust rules. So in the US, the FTC was actually created by Congress in response to a judicial decision. So when the Standard Oil decision came down in 1911, there was a huge pushback by Congress because the court had introduced in Standard Oil this concept of rule of reason. And legislatures saw that as a huge power grab by the courts. They instantly recognized that this rule of reason approach would allow basically courts to anoint themselves as the arbiters of what was really going to be pro-competitive or anti-competitive under the antitrust laws. And so they actually created the FTC as a way for Congress to take back power from the courts, believing that creating this administrative agency that would be accountable to Congress would be a way that Congress can ensure that substantive antitrust rules are also being created by this more democratically accountable body rather than just by the courts. in practice, the FTC has failed to play this administrative role and has instead become, somewhat of a younger sibling to the Justice Department, and has only engaged in antitrust primarily through bringing lawsuits, which again, end up giving a lot of deference to the court. So I actually totally agree that the institutional structure needs to be reworked such that these broader considerations are being made appropriately by lawmakers. And then we also need, a shift in the balance of power between the agencies and the courts.
Yeah, I think I agree. I would just maybe make a small difference between, there are three objectives you could imagine that people would advocate for. One is take into account the environment. That I just think it's neither here nor there, because I don't think, first of all, I don't know where the sign would be plus or minus. Like, do you think big firms would more or less? I think that's neither practical nor actually, I think, useful. The environment should be protected completely, strongly and independently of any kind of antitrust. Inequality is a tiny bit different because we do have a bit more evidence today that in some local labor market, mergers can have a depressing impact on wages. So that's not literally so that I think should be part of the standard. But I don't think you need to change it's still about competition. It's just that we shouldn't think about competition exclusively as a monopoly, but also monopsony. And I think when you think about the platforms, the monopsony part is very important, both vis-a-vis the suppliers and in some cases vis-a-vis the local labor market. So, but I don't think, it's not like you care about the equity per se, it's just that that should be part of your mandate. You think about competition. Otherwise, the danger that we're going to have is that you're going to have, if you ask judges to take into account impact of employment or stuff like that, I think that's just going to be a disaster. So I would be against that.
So maybe to follow up on this great discussion with regards to democratic accountability, in one way or another, this discussion and other research that you've produced has contributed to the questions surrounding the threat to our democratic institutions in the face of all forms of market concentration. So maybe here two sets of small questions. One has to do with whether you see all kind of concentrated power as a threat to democracy, or is it mainly applying to the tech giants and digital monopolies? But also, where do you stand vis-a-vis arguments that equally problematic is big government as well? And concentrated enforcement is also as problematic to our democratic institutions.
So let me start on this, since I'm probably one of the most aggressive on this front. I think that all concentrated power is dangerous. And I have a lot of friends and colleagues who say that they prefer a sort of a google.gov rather than a gov.gov. That they prefer that if there is this immense amount of power, this should be in the hands of the private sector and not in the hand of the public sector. And their justification is that the public sector already has a monopoly, the one of the use of force. And that's a monopoly we don't challenge because we don't want fights among warlords. So the risk, he said, is amplified. And I think that this is a false dichotomy, because the moment Google has all that information about us, the government can get the information from Google. And so I don't see, in fact, it can get in the most devious way rather than the most transparent way. So I think that there is no way that once the information is concentrated, the government is not going to get it. So the question is, I then prefer that the government to have it so that there is some democratic accountability versus a world in which this democratic accountability doesn't exist. And to your point, it's not unique of digital power. In the sense, we don't study enough what United Fruits did in Honduras, but we call Banana Republic for a reason. That if you only produce banana and the only producer and buy a banana is United Fruits, you're not a free country. And I think that this problem is very severe. Is very severe for the United States. paradoxically is even more severe for other countries. India is trying to reintroduce the C word, which is colonization. And at the end of the day, if Google and Facebook have all your data and basically can decide who's going to be elected president, because they can, then are you really an independent country or not?
I would agree with much of that. I think concentration of economic power concentrates political power, and that is by no means unique to the digital context. In the US, we are certainly facing a situation, as Thomas's work has shown, where concentration is increasingly a systemic feature of our economy, not just isolated to digital markets, but increasingly prevalent in major sectors like telecom, airlines, but also all sorts of much more obscure industries like eyeglasses or hospital beds or funeral caskets. It's really a systemic problem in the United States, and I think it has led to the concentration of political power, which these firms and concentrated lobbies can use in a whole set of ways. I think oftentimes the kind of mechanism through which concentrated economic power is translated into political power, a lot of the attention is focused on lobbying, on campaign finance, but there really is a much more expansive and subtle set of levers that are used and that really get even to the basics of information production and what information is being produced and allowed to influence regulators or not influence regulators. So I would agree, it's not just a problem that's limited to tech. I do think, though, that the recent US election underscored the huge dangers of allowing effectively Facebook to, decide whether election misinformation was going to distort a huge segment of the population's understanding of who won or not. You had a situation where you basically had elected officials begging Mark Zuckerberg to take action. And I think that concentration of power within not just Facebook, but within Mark Zuckerberg, this one individual, really underscored just the grotesque perversities of the situation and the deep threat to democracy in this asymmetry of power.
So I want to emphasize one thing, which is whether or not the digital platform for information have changed the game or not, it's still very unclear in the data. It's actually, I think the jury is clearly still out. Much of the research we've had on the impact of news cycles on Facebook, Twitter versus standard broadcasting such as Fox News suggests that Fox News has immensely more influence than Twitter or Facebook on what people believe. So the idea that the digital platforms are worse in a sense at spreading fake news, I don't think it's, at the very least, we don't know. And in fact, much of the early research suggests that's not true. Like much of the disinformation is via TV, and just like in the past, it was via newspapers. So if you read, I mean, I think I would be cautious about saying that we live in a world of unprecedented craziness in ideas or disinformation. If you read the press of the 19th century, it was batshit insane. If you read, I mean, and the corruption was very deep. Like we think about foreign influence. Well, the Russians bought the French journalists in the 1900s, like literally bought them to write script. So this is a level much higher than what we have today. So I don't think we should be too pessimistic there. What the reason people are so upset, I think, but I might be wrong, but let's offer that as a hypothesis, is because some of us were optimistic that the social media, because they are freer in a sense, they would reflect the fundamental goodness of people. And so we were expecting social media to be fundamentally different from the rest of the media. And then we discover that no, Rousseau was wrong. And then if you leave people by themselves, they don't produce something great by themselves. I think people are disappointed with that and they blame it on social media, which is just purely a reflection of what society really is. I don't think it has that much influence. The only exception is the pure coordination possibility, which is the fact that you have now a system where you can coordinate people in a decentralized way. And then, of course, I mean, this week we've had the GameStop story with Reddit. That was not possible before, okay? Because you need to be able to coordinate 1 million people on one stock in real time. Okay, so that we couldn't do before. So the pure coordination effect is new, but the disinformation, the craziness of ideas, the willingness to listen to batshit insane conspiracy theories, that is not new at all. So I don't think that social media has changed that to a large extent.
So let me echo Thomas here, because as an Italian, I remember when people were wondering in the United States or being outraged that Russia influenced the election, I said, wait a minute, the United States influenced every election in the United States since World War II. So what's new here? This is just a standard. It's the modus operandi. There is nothing new about that. So in that sense, I agree with him. And I also agree with him that now we are in this celebration of the past where the old media were fantastic and the new media are terrible. And Thomas is right. There's nothing like that. In fact, I just released an episode of Capitalism with Matt Taibbi, who is a pretty strong voice on that. And I think is very true. The media of the past were terrible in our own country, but also in the United States, if you look very carefully. And Chomsky has demonstrated that. And now that we have different kind of problems. So it's more difficult to get away with hiding stuff because of the social media. It's also true that fringes get to coordinate much more easily. In this, Thomas, I think I disagree slightly on the coordination. This is in the past, the only way to coordinate, if you have a few hedge funds and you met in the same bar in New York, you could mobilize a lot of capital at the same time. Now, and that's what some of the traders are saying, that now is equalized, and even the small guys can coordinate by finding in a virtual bar. And of course, the difference is that when they coordinate finding a virtual bar, they change the rules on the fly. On the other hand, when the hedge fund manager coordinate, they don't change the rules on the fly. So that's the asymmetry that we see today.
So maybe just a last question to wrap up this discussion before we open to the Q&A. We started, Luigi, you started at the very beginning. You said that we're at a turning point in antitrust, and maybe my very last question has to do with whether a lot of the positives that we were seeing in both the US and European approach to antitrust, but in other places around the world, from thinking about how to break up monopolies, to treat them as public utilities, to limit their market abuse through a stringent ex-post antitrust enforcement, all solutions that the three of you have written about, whether you think that these solutions are still valid with the pandemic in the background, or do you think that the momentum that we were witnessing is going to slow down? How do you see some of these issues that you've talked about somehow changing in that current unprecedented situation, not just with regards to the media, but particularly with regards to the pandemic?
I think that the biggest change of the pandemic is that have increased both the power, but also the public image of some of these platforms. So nobody doubts that Amazon has been incredibly useful during the pandemic, and we had a pandemic before Amazon. Life, at least in the United States, I don't know in Europe, and at least in the United States, would have been more difficult. Let's put it this way. And so I think that this, on the one hand, has increased the need to intervene to avoid even more concentration and monopolization. On the other hand, might have weakened the political desire to do so, because one of the challenges I see of the 21st century is antitrust was born, at least in the United States, as a consumer movement, especially initially from farmers, because of the excessive power of railways. And railways were charging too high price to move around the wheat, basically disadvantages massively small farmers. And so there was a very strong economic reason for small farmers and consumers also to complain and react. Today is consumers tend to benefit tremendously, at least on the front end, by some of these institutions. It says Google Map is free, Gmail is free, Facebook is free, Amazon is not free, but G is much cheaper than a lot of other stuff. So I think the constituency for a serious intervention is more difficult to create than in the future. And so when I said we are at the cusp of a potential change, I think it's true, but I'm not so sure on what direction of the cusp we're going to go. So if the Biden administration were to appoint Lina Khan as the head of the FTC, then we're going to go in one direction. If they're going to appoint some of the old people, we're going to go in a different direction. I think that literally in the next few weeks, if not months, we're going to see where we're going.
So I agree that the pandemic has, of course, underscored the power, but also the usefulness of some of these services, and that's creating an opportunity for them to, shore up their reputations. I do think that, whether it's conceptually coherent or not, the content moderation decisions of these platforms at the politician level is fueling a lot of the scrutiny, and I think will keep up the pressure on the antitrust side. I also think, to go to Luigi's point about, the potential coalitions here, and that because consumers primarily like these services, you may have a weaker chance of moving forward. I do think that one feature of the political coalitions here that does stand out is that it's not isolated to one sector of the economy or isolated to one industry. It's really the Fortune, 490 that are feeling in some way or another pinched by these 4 or 5 companies. And so I think politically that actually creates a lot of momentum, especially if you think about, how politicians and lawmakers respond, right? So if it is not just, the small newspapers, but also News Corp that is advocating for antitrust action against Google, that just creates a very different political situation, right? Which you might like, you might not like, but I do think that the risks of a lot of this pressure dying down are lessened by virtue of the fact that there is just such a broader segment of the kind of corporate economy that feels in some way or another aggrieved or harmed or abused by these companies. And so I think that the risk of the pressure dying down is therefore less. That, of course, does open up the potential for more charges that antitrust action will be protectionist and will therefore be designed to help a News Corp or help another giant. But I do think that the kind of descriptive analysis of what the political situation looks like is accurate.
I think that the first order effect of the pandemic on that question has been to change a bit what people consider, essential services. I think that's going to change the debate going forward in a way that are not necessarily easy to predict. It is true that Amazon is now perceived as being extremely important, but people also think that being able to get goods delivered at home is part of a very important, sometimes even essential service. So the first impact of that was that the scrutiny that was given to any idea of merging the home food delivery was actually stronger, not weaker than before. So it increased actually the antitrust scrutiny in that case. To the point that Lina just raised, just that there is one statistic in my book which is not true anymore. So, I mean, it's not that bad out of 300 pages, but in the book I make a big case that if you look at the top 5 firms in the US, they always represent roughly 10% of the stock market. So if you look at the list of the top 5 firms in, say, 1975 or 1980, you're going to have, ExxonMobil, Procter and Gamble, and things like that, AT&T, IBM. If you add up their market value, it's 10% of the market. And if you do it like period by period, it's always 10% of the market. The names change. Walmart shows up in the 90s and Microsoft, later on Apple, and as you can imagine. But if you look at the top 5, it's already 10% of the market. It was true in December 2019. So that number had been roughly constant for, say, 20 or 30 years. And then in 6 months, it doubled because of the pandemic. So today, the top 5 are 20% of the market. So that means that in terms of relative value adjustments, like who's going to capture the share of economic ranks going forward, this is massive. I don't know for sure it's going to stay like that. Of course, there could be some mean reversion, but just the sheer magnitude of the change is massive. So the point that Lina was just mentioned, which is the Fortune 495 against the top 5, I think that's definitely more true than before. And the last point to keep in mind is historically coalitions have always been opportunistic, pretty much for every big decision. If you look at the coalition that pushed for the single market in the EU, it was the most heteroclite, like incoherent, with people on the left and the right and all of different ideas, just happened to agree on one objective and then they create a coalition for that. I think that's what we're going to see. And that also suggests that perhaps apart from Facebook and Google, who are kind of similar in some ways, the coalitions that might push against Apple versus Amazon versus Google are going to be different also. They're not going to be the same people. And we're just going to have to be a bit opportunistic when we do it.
So I love the optimism of my colleagues, and I think that there is definitely some value to that. My question is to what extent the 495 Fortune 500 can coalesce on a single topic, which is defend competition. To what extent they can each lobby for their own little favor. And on this, I would like to raise a question because I have a certain position, but other people think differently. I don't know if you have followed, but in Australia, there's a recent law that was passed that created a lot of turmoil. They say that basically Google has to pay for news, and to pay a price for news that is going to be agreed upon by the two parties. If not, there's an arbitration in which basically the government decide or whatever, something that is going to be pretty favorable to the producer of news. Now, the interesting thing, Australia is not a random place. It's a place where, to the point of Lina, 90% of the traditional news are owned by Murdoch. So this is pretty much Murdoch organizing a defense of News Corp by introducing a law to redistribute from Google to itself. As much as I don't like Google and its monopoly power, I hate in the same way Murdoch and his monopoly power. So I don't find that a particularly attractive solution. But I would like to know what my colleagues think about it and what they would do in a case like Australia.
Yeah, I agree. I also follow that. It's actually interesting because on the digital regulation side, Australia is also being quite at the forefront. So when we looked at the Digital Act for the EU, much of the discussion about how do you implement the principles compared the two places where you could find advanced thinking and good ideas in that front were the UK, of course, but also Australia. So I tend to agree with, in the specific case, I tend to agree with Luigi, but the way I think about it is really, again, about this global landscape, which is, you cannot, good ideas are going to pop up in random places. And so the best you can hope for is to keep an open mind and then try to pick the best ideas in every location. And News Corp is dominant in Australia, but it's not dominant in the EU. And so, you know, if we don't choose that ideas because it was in fact driven by illegitimate lobbying, then I think in the long run, you know, we're going to learn from each other. The tricky part is more like, is there enough? With the news, there's a tipping point issue, which is if people in Australia realize that the rest of the world did not copy their brilliant idea, they should think that's because it was a bad idea. But that's true only if they get the real news. Okay.
I would agree. I think opportunism is always going to be rampant in these types of situations where people are scrambling for a new set of rules and regulations. I do think, you know, whatever the merits of the specific Australian regulation aside, I do think that the news industry poses such a central, it plays such a central role in our democracy that I think it absolutely is a appropriate site of a lot of government attention. In the United States, at least, you know, our journalism industry is in crisis, especially at the local level, where you have a proliferation of news deserts, and you see quite expressly a lot of the ad revenue that has gone from traditional content producers and journalistic outfits to the platforms. And so I think just as a basic matter, that being a urgent situation that deserves a lot of scrutiny, to ensure that we actually do have a robust news ecosystem that can provide citizens with accurate news, I think that is of paramount importance. And so I think if that ends up being a site of legal interventions where some people get it right, some people get it wrong, and then we can all learn from each other. I think that makes a lot of sense, because I just think that the stakes of not doing anything and allowing local journalism in particular to totally founder are just so high. I mean, we're seeing right now, especially with kind of basic misinformation about the pandemic actively leading to lives being lost and all sorts of that happening. I think it's just a grave situation.
Thank you all very much for this amazing discussion. I now hand over to Aisha, who is LEPI's research fellow, and Roberto, back to Roberto, to moderate the audience's questions.
So thank you very much. It was really amazing and super interesting. So the big frustration that I have is that we cannot have a dinner later, so that we can go on with this fantastic discussion. So I'm learning a lot. So let me start first with my own question. Then we will shift to some of the interesting questions that we have from the audience. So in the recent years, so there is one thing that we see more and more in Europe is a sort of, there are many commentators that seem to support the idea that European national champions are needed to face the competition from those big firms from the US or from Asian giants. And so the idea is that if we don't structure differently the competition in Europe, and we don't allow these European champions to go, we will lose jobs. So Thomas was correctly pointing out that the link between concentrations and wages appear to be potentially negative. So what would you do if you were like sort of advising the European Union in this sense? So because the debate was very much on the US, but and we are sort of idealizing Europe, but there are many political forces that push toward more concentration in Europe. So that I would like to have your take on this.
Well, I think it's an easy answer. Just don't listen to them. The idea of European champion is bogus, is pushed by lobbies for all the wrong reasons, and they are always wrong. So that's the easy answer. Now, of course, the political answer is more complicated. Then I think it's going to be one of these cases where I do cite Luigi in my book because he has a great way of summarizing some of the issues. So I was a bit optimistic because I thought that Europe had set up a set of institutions that would allow rational and pro-competition decision-making. But Luigi pointed out, yeah, that's true. But to some extent, Europe is just 10 years or 15 behind the US in terms of the regulation. So if you think about the cycle, that means we're just going to go in the same endpoint in just 10 or 15 years later. So that's going to be one of these cases where we might disagree. I'm optimistic about Europe because changing the rules, it's very hard. So my interpretation of the push in Germany and France for a national champion is it's mostly PR. I think the Germans are not serious about it. They don't actually want to do it. The French might want to do it. At least some of them want, because that's like a national sport. But I think to me, like the idea of national champion is a bit like trying to say, oh, because the UK left the EU, we're going to try to push for French to become a national language in Brussels again. I think this is just like lip service to nonsensical ideas. So I don't think it's going to go very far. But the deep reason is because there is no consensus on that. Like, to go back to the example Luigi mentioned earlier of Alstom and Siemens. So if you read Alstom Siemens in the French or German press, you get the impression that it's two countries against Margaret of Vestager, who is the one standing against the development of Europe. This is completely not true. Like, every single other country in Europe was very much against the merger because they understood very well that it was two big countries playing bullies against the rest. And the fact that the Commission stood its ground was perceived as great news everywhere, except for like a few offices in Paris and Berlin. So that's the right interpretation. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Now, the thing that's important, though, is to link that to trade policy. So there is a legitimate discussion about trade policy. That is, it is true that if you open your public market to foreign bidders and the foreign countries do not open their public market to your own companies, there is an asymmetry there. And countries, China in particular, have been playing that game in a way which is unbalanced, and then calls for potentially tougher and more aggressive trade policy at the EU level. That is completely legitimate. But what happens it's used. It's like the useful idiot story. Like there's a legitimate discussion about trade policy, and then you have a bunch of lobbyists who couldn't care less about that, but just looking for an excuse to push their own agenda. So they jump on that bandwagon to come up with the answer that the answer is national champions. But that's neither here nor there. That's completely unrelated. The answer is tough trade policy and no national champions.
Again, I'm a little bit less optimistic than Thomas. In a sense, I agree so fundamentally with his view of lobbying. My concern is that the most effective lobbying is a lobbying that has some resonance with something that people believe and sounds true. So the worst things in the United States are done with at least an appearance of legitimacy. Think about all the disasters on house financing. They were done under the rubric, we need to give a house to every American, which is a beautiful thing and nobody can quarrel with. Or think about the disaster now with the student loans. We want to help people study, give an opportunity to everybody. And this is the worst economic policy disasters have always behind a legitimate or quasi-legitimate reason. And I think that this of national champions is becoming one. And this is, I think that if you look at, for example, the development of AI, and you see the tension between China and the United States, I think there are legitimate strategic reasons to try to be at the top of AI. And I think that the more data you have, probably the better you are, and so on and so forth. And so there is a competition that is not just competition. This is really a potential war tension. And I think that we need to do better on that front in order to fight back, because when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying to Congress, he had some notes from his lawyers. Well, very well paid, so I guess they're probably very smart. They were saying, remind Congress people that Facebook is facing the threat of the Chinese. Okay, so this is the ultimate trump card, no pun intended or maybe intended, but a trump card that they can use to fight any form of competition, etc. So I think that the way to explain to Europe is to say, look, we need to create the condition for the market to be competitive, because especially in the digital world, all the economies of scale, etc., are already somewhere else. So I think that we need to enforce, at least in Europe, interoperability, so to reduce some of the network externalities that lead to this enormous aggregation. As economists, all too often, we take network externalities as a technological given that cannot be changed. But phones had enormous network externalities at the beginning of the 20th century. And then we forced interoperability, and boom, you can have competition. Nobody is worried that if I cannot call Thomas because I have a T-Mobile phone and he has a Verizon phone. This is given like as accepted. But we do have a problem. I have my group of high school friends that were all on WhatsApp. Now they try to move on Signal. Now half of one is on WhatsApp, the other is on Signal. It's a nightmare. Why can't I have simply a platform that allows me to tap the one on Signal, the one on WhatsApp, and manage the two at the same time? This is technologically possible. It's just regulation that has prevented this from happening.
I don't have too much to add, except to note that it is interesting that Zuckerberg and as well as a whole other set of companies have been pointing to China as, you know, the kind of threat, whereas if the US regulates its monopolies, it's going to weaken them relative to the Chinese companies. Yeah, what we've seen over the last couple of months is that China seems to be taking a more aggressive approach to its own national monopolies, right? They've kind of forced Ant to reorganize itself as a more traditional financial company, and seem to be, at least from an outsider's perspective, actually taking a very different approach than what we've seen in the US. So it'll be interesting to see whether that, whether that dichotomy of, hey, if you weaken us, we're not going to be able to fight it out with the Chinese giants, just how coherent that remains if we do in fact see China go in this direction.
Yeah,
Just
add
as
to
an
Lina's
aside,
point, I think it's fascinating. She's right that China is intervening on the digital giant much more aggressively than the US. And I suspect because with all their embracing of capitalism, all the Chinese leaders have been forming the Marxism. And so they understand power very, very well. And they understand that concentration of digital power might lead to the demise of their ruling and their Communist Party. So they are very aggressive in bringing down the digital monopolies because they understand what we in the Western world have not fully understood, which is how much power they have.
But the national security argument is as old as capitalism. So that was one of the lead arguments in the AT&T case. So AT&T, to avoid the breakup, they lobbied very hard the Department of Defense to convince the generals that really AT&T was the last line of defense against the Russians in the telecom business, and therefore it was absolutely impossible to break up AT&T without putting the whole country in danger. So so that is not new, and this is typical. I think it fits exactly in the framework Luigi gave, which is there's a valid argument, like foreign powers are not benevolent. So there's a valid argument, but then it's used in a strategic way to push for something that really has nothing to do with the true goal.
Okay, so seeing our time constraints, even though the conversation is going very well, I will have to limit our questions and then direct one question to each of our speakers. So I'll go first with you, Lina. I suppose that's kind of obvious. First, the question is asked to you, but also I suppose those of us, the antitrust nerds in the audience, will know that you identify yourself as a new Brandeisian, part of the anti-monopoly movement, which brings back some of the components of Louis Brandeis' work from the turn of the 20th century. But the question here is, we are looking at completely different markets today with multinational companies spanning many jurisdictions. And in this context, and I would like to also add that, the change to the Chicago School happened late 60s, early 70s, let's say, and this also corresponds to globalization. Before then, the US was a big internal markets of its own, which drastically changed. Of course, correlation doesn't mean causation, but do you think about this aspect in your work? And also, our attendee asks, is there a risk of regulatory arbitrage similar to tax havens, and will there be antitrust havens, do you think? I'll just move on quickly with the questions, and then I'll give each of you a few minutes to answer. Sorry about the time constraints. The second is, we have, and I suppose I'll direct this to Toma because he's the one who mentioned the Reddit GameStop saga, which also it reminds me of blockchain, because we had the same problem with, we have the same discussion with blockchain and blockchain pools, mining pools. So we are looking at millions of people able to cooperate online, which is something that couldn't have happened prior to the online era. And do you think this will have these considerations, which didn't exist before digitalization? Will they have now an impact in the thinking of antitrust authorities? And I guess our third question would be to Luigi, because he was the one mentioning radical innovation. Bringing back the innovation considerations, do you think that, and I'm combining a few questions here from the audience, now we're looking at innovation happening in very different ways. What we understand from innovation is no longer maybe the 20th century understanding of patentable innovation. How we protect innovation and finance and financialize innovation have completely changed in the digital era. And do you think this should have an impact on the thinking of antitrust authorities? And I would like to maybe add a sentence here. There is also the question of the direction of innovation. Do you think antitrust authorities should also think about the direction of innovation in their enforcement actions? So in that direction, in that order, if you would like to answer these questions. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think we could have a whole panel discussion just on that question. I mean, I think the international dimension here is really fascinating, and it'll be interesting to see. I do think we're kind of living through a bit of a natural experiment. to see what happens as different jurisdictions go in different directions and how the companies respond. It's absolutely true that the increase in globalization around the 70s was absolutely at the backdrop of a lot of the arguments for why we needed to weaken antitrust rules as well as regulations. I do think that, you know, there will be certain jurisdictions that are so important to these companies that I don't think there's going to be a real risk of exit if these jurisdictions introduce rules that these companies find, you know, onerous or draconian. Anu Bradford has coined the term the Brussels effect, right? For when your regulations in Europe end up serving as a floor. And I think it'll be interesting to see which aspects of regulations and antitrust enforcement and rules derived as a result of antitrust enforcement end up serving as that floor. I think GDPR is an interesting example where I don't think we have seen the data protections introduced by GDPR serve as a floor in other jurisdictions, but it'll be interesting to see what happens, especially with the antitrust actions.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yeah, I think I think what I was saying earlier is in my mind, what is really new with digital media is not so much the issue of content, it's or the fact that there is fake news, or the fact that it sometimes reflects the worst of mankind, because that was already true in the press and the media of the past. The thing that is new is the possibility of large-scale coordination of decentralized teams of people. Of course, that can bring costs. People can coordinate for the wrong reason or to do something illegal, but has a tremendous benefit. And to me, so there in that framework, I think the key is, if you want to realize the potential benefit of that, you need to make sure that you regulate or you keep an eye on the gatekeepers, because the gatekeepers are the ones standing in between, you know, the flow of information of different people. And so the notion that in this world, if you're a gatekeeper to flows, then you have specific duties and specific regulations, that makes sense to me. I mean, you don't want to go overboard, but the notion that gatekeepers should be subject to specific regulations, which is sort of where the EU is going now, in the broad sense, I think it makes total sense. But I just want to point something out here, which is, we've been discussing, but I think maybe we haven't emphasized enough that there's plenty of things we don't know. Like, we don't know the true answers, and part of the reason is because we haven't, not enough research has been done on these topics. So that circles back to something Luigi said in his introduction, and the failure in academia, because I think it would be unfair to finish without mentioning that. Like, if you think about the past 10, 20 years, we had two major economic, well, the pandemic is different, but we have the financial crisis in 2008. And the financial crisis is a massive failure of research in financial economics. And Luigi has written beautifully about that. But like, so few people did the research that would have been useful in preventing the crisis, or even understanding the buildup of the risk. Okay, and part of the reason was because their incentives was to be aligned with the financial industry and not ask the hard question and not do the hard research. And so that was like very clear. And I think, to me, where we are today in the antitrust discussion, and the fact that we are so far behind the curve in having good answers to questions about the digital market, is a complete failure of the IO economic research in industrial organization, which is amazingly behind the curve. And exactly the same way financial economists were behind the curve in 2008, and for the same reason, which is their own interest was aligned with the industry in not challenging the common wisdom, especially with digital markets. So I think that is a massive failure that we're going to have to remedy going forward. And the only part of the reason we were saved to some extent, and you have to, I mean, it's kind of striking for young people, I think it's a very important message to hear, is thanks to people like Lina. But you have to remember, when she wrote her paper, the Amazon Antitrust Paradox, she was 28 and just a student, and she was doing something that the old well-established academic should have done 10 years earlier. So on the one hand, it's a tribute to her talent. On the other hand, it's an indictment of the past. So I think that's if you one thing to take away is that there's so much more research that needs to be done. Okay.
Thank you, Soma. Luigi? Luigi, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks to Matt who have brought back that topic. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that it's not a coincidence that the only two economists here are two financial economists, because at least for me, but I think that maybe for Thomas is the same, is I felt very deeply embarrassed when the financial crisis came that my work was not more useful, at least up to that point, to prevent and fight the financial crisis. And so I dedicated a lot of attention to the financial industry. And after that, it came natural to go to the next problem, which was the concentration and the digital, especially in the digital platforms. And so I ended up being a little bit ahead of the curve, not as much as Lina, but ahead of the curve vis-a-vis my colleagues, simply because I was looking for a similar problem that the one that affected the financial industry. So I think that there's a very strong correlation between the two. This, trying to answer the question that I raised, I think that innovation is, of course, a very important aspect in determining the merger policy. And one of the challenges is that it's very hard to prove what innovation would have been in a but-for world. Sorry if I mention again and again, but in the last couple of weeks, there was a podcast I did and an interview for the Microsoft case. My colleague Topel, who was an expert witness for on the side of Microsoft, and he dismissed any argument about innovation by saying, "Oh, you can say anything about what innovation would be in a but-for world," and so that doesn't hold in court. And that's part of the problem, is that because is in hypothetical, it's very hard to win the case. But I would like to give a shout out to Tommaso Valletti, who was the head of the economic section of the economic research section of the commission. And in analyzing some mergers, he actually spent time looking at how much overlap there were between some big pharma companies in their R&D, and to what extent R&D would have been reduced by the merger and has been reduced by the merger. And I think that that's one direction we should definitely go. Now, the problem, of course, as we know, is that input is not equal to output. So R&D input is not necessarily equal to output. And so it's much easier to see a reduction in input, much less to see a reduction in output. But I think this is something that definitely we should pay a lot of attention in the future.
So thank you very much for all of these interesting answers. I think that we have to conclude, unfortunately. So 2 hours went very fast. So it's been super nice to have you here. So we are all very grateful. And so before we conclude, let me just remind to the audience that we will soon be circulating the advertisement for the next event that will be about artificial intelligence and the law. Okay, so thank you very much again to Lina, to Luigi, and to Thomas. And I hope to see you soon in person. Bye.